I want to find out the backstory of how you got so interested in Native American art and where you grew up. And clearly, you had parents that were very, very influential. So, where did you grow up?
I grew up in Lee Summit, Missouri,
I know where that is.
which is an eastern suburb of Kansas City.
Yes.
And when we moved there. I mean, it was a sleepy, almost kind of rural town, even though it's only 20 minutes from downtown Kansas City. It too has changed enormously. It now looks like the more affluent suburbs in Johnson County, where our museum is. But my father's primary business was honey processing, and he had built up. He was the second biggest honey processor in America,
Mm.
and he supplied all of the associated grocers, Stuckey's, Nickerson Farms. A lot of people may remember those red roofed buildings and the
Yeah.
blue roofed buildings at all of these ex.
I think your phone unmuted. There you are.
Anyway, he had his plant there for processing. So we moved to Lee Summit. And when I was probably about 5 years old, my father decided that because he had grown up on a farm and he used to, and now this is when they used mules, mind you, for plowing,
Wow.
he decided that he had always had great fun picking up arrowheads, so-called arrowheads, as they came up out of the ground in the furrows. And he decided that a great thing for he and I to bond over was to go out and hunt arrowheads in plowed fields. And so sure enough, we would go out after a rain, and we would walk these plowed fields in the spring. And of known campgrounds, he would talk to a lot of farmers and people in different areas, you know. And we would drive an hour or two to get to a certain site, and we would walk that. And my father was the type that if I found a broken arrowhead and held it up, he would rush over and he would say, "Oh my God, you're the first human being to touch that in 6,000 years." I mean, I felt like I'd found the Hope Diamond. And so, I mean, it was so infectious. And at his funeral, some of the relatives, you know, we did the usual lunch after the funeral and everything, which is common in the Midwest. Um, and people started telling stories about my father. And the older relatives said, you know, we used to walk the fields with your dad, and we would all come in at lunch, and we were just children. But she said we couldn't eat at the table with the adults. So we would all go sit under a big shade tree, and we would just be talking about silly things. And she said, all of a sudden, your dad would start unbuttoning buttons on his coveralls, and he'd reach in and start pulling out these arrowheads and laying them out on the ground. And he could spot them just immediately. And my aunt said, his sister, she said, I never could find a damn thing. You know, I never found anything. But she said he could just spot it immediately. Well, anyway, that launched us into joining some of the archaeological societies. We began collecting prehistoric Mississippian Hopewellian material, um, and got very involved. We started going to some of the big shows that occur in St. Louis and that sort of thing. And we would literally spend almost every weekend, my father and I would get in the pickup truck and we would drive to some small town. And he was one of those people. I suspect you're similar, Mark. He would walk into a barber shop and he'd introduce himself and he'd say, do you know of anyone around here that collects arrowheads? And inevitably, if it wasn't the barber, there'd be some older man sitting in there. He'd go, well, yeah, so and so, he's this farmer. He has boxes of them. He picks them up and axes. And my father would, write down his name and get his phone number and everything. And we would just arrive at his home unannounced and knock on the front door. Today, you'd probably be shot. But, you know, 55 years ago, people would come to the door, you'd announce yourself and you're interested in arrowheads. They would invite you right in. Oftentimes they'd say, would you like to stay for dinner? And so it was this, I look back on that childhood and it seems like another lifetime practically. But my dad would stay there if there was one really great, rare point. We would just stay and stay and stay, and he would try and talk the farmer out of it. And he began amassing this major collection. And in 1970, he had gotten to know a stockbroker here in Kansas City, who was over in Lawrence, Kansas, Mark. And there was an old time Indian trader that lived there by the name of Pat Reed. And that may not mean anything to you, but his family built the first mercantile store in Lawrence, Kansas, where the University of Kansas is. It's about 30 minutes west of us. And he was a friend with C.G. Wallace's and all those early traders. At one point, he had a trading post, so-called, in Albuquerque. And then he was operating out of a hotel in Lawrence, Kansas. And then in later years, he had like an addition on his home where he had a Native American trading post. And George Lewis was over in Lawrence, Kansas. He went in and he called my dad that evening and he said, "Oh my God, Dad, I think I've made such a mistake." And my father said, "What do you mean?" And he said, this guy had this small cabinet there and it was filled with baskets, smaller baskets. And he said it was marked not for sale. And he said there were 50 baskets in there. And I decided that I was going to try and talk him out of those. And he said, he finally said, "Well, I'll sell them, but the price will be outrageous." And he said, "Well, how much?" And he said, "I want $5,000 for all of them, for 50 baskets." Now that included all these pomo feather baskets and all sorts of things that today, we treasure. But by the time he got home and was confronted by his wife, who wondered why he had blown $5,000 when they had a home mortgage and hadn't paid off their cars and everything, he called my dad in desperation and he said, "You just got to help me out. You got to buy some of these baskets." And my father said, "Well, I don't know." He said, "They're just made out of grass." And George Lewis immediately said, "All those arrowheads you have, they're nothing but rocks." And my father was so taken aback because what could you say? Yeah. He said they have no intrinsic value. We're not talking about gold or silver here. Anyway, my father was just dumbfounded. No one had ever talked to him like that. And he said, "Well, I don't know anything about him." And George said, "I'm going to get in the car and drive out to Lee Summit right now." And he said, "I'm going to bring you 2 books on Indian baskets, one by Mason and the other one, I can't remember the name of the other. Oh, George Wharton James."
Oh, yeah.
And he said, "I'm going to leave them with you." And my dad sat down and read both of them fully that weekend. And on Monday, he said, "I want to buy some of those baskets." And that launched us on buying historic material. And my parents fell in love with baskets. It became one of the major things that they collected. And in fact, if you should ever be at the Nelson Atkins Museum and you go up to the Native American wing, you'll see this extraordinary Lucy Tellis basket that is covered with hummingbirds and butterflies and floral designs, which was a basket that we bought, decades ago from some people in Pittsburgh, Kansas, and then eventually it went to the Nelson Atkins Museum. You'll see that on view. But baskets became my father's great love. And so who would have ever thought? And from there, boom, we were into weavings and pottery and rugs. And, all through junior high and high school, I'll never forget. I was in junior high, I must have been probably in the 8th grade. And all of a sudden they called my name over the intercom. It was about 1:30 in the afternoon. And of course, you're in the 8th grade and everybody's like, oh, Bruce did something.
Yeah, he's in
It was
trouble.
in the principal's office. And everyone's like, ooh, you're
Yeah,
in trouble.
I had to figure this.
I didn't know what it was about. So I hooked it up to the principal's office, and my father was standing there. He said, how would you like to fly to Los Angeles and go to an auction of Native American art? And I said, when? And he said, right now. And we left right from there, got in the car and drove to the airport, flew to Los Angeles, and went to this Native American auction, which turned out to be really terrible. But but we had a grand time nonetheless, just running around. And Mark, it became the most extraordinary adventure, and it was such an incredible thing to share with my parents.
Yeah,
Um,
Ben.
and I think that's one reason why I say I look back and I don't want to sugarcoat everything like it was just all incredible. Um, you know, we all had our difficulties too, like all of us growing up have. But it was the most amazing adventure, the most incredible experience. And when I talk to collectors, I love to share that story because it is something that can become infectious and that can really bring a family together, shared interest.
Did you have any other brothers or sisters?
I have a sister who had zero interest in all of it. And she was the wild child.
Yeah.
She was the one that was crawling out the bedroom window at midnight to go off and attend a rock concert. And she had an electric guitar and formed her own rock band. And I was the one that was so studious and was like reading up on Native American basketry and everything.
And so did you, when you were in high school, did you continue to have this love of Native American? Because often, girls get in the way, sports, whatever.
It never stopped.
Wow, that's
I
great.
mean, for me, it has been a continuous love, passion. Um, uh, you know, uh, oh my God, for you know, um, probably 58 years.
When did
I'm
you graduate?
64.
You're 64. Okay. So
Mhm.
you missed out on the Vietnam.
My graduating class was the last group of men I had to register for the draft
Oh, you did.
in 1975.
Yeah, that was the
Um,
last bit of it.
but immediately after that, my parents were totally freaked out.
Yeah.
They probably sensed that I was probably not going to be a survivor in Vietnam.
Yeah.
Totally distracted by some bright shiny object. Um, but but fortunately, they ended it. They ended the draft for it and everything.
Yeah. Well, it is concerning for parents when you're at that time frame, especially.
Oh,
I mean,
unquestionable.
yeah. So you were
My
right.
parents were what I would call my parents conservative, but very open to things.
Mhm.
And I'll never forget my father had a group of so-called hippies come into his honey processing plant back in the late 60s. And my father was the type that would rail about hippies when he was watching television, the news and everything. My parents were much older when my sister and I were born.
Hmm.
So it was an anomaly. My mother was 36 when I was born, and most women her age, this is in the late 50s, my God, their kids were 15 and 16 years old. But my parents decided they wanted to have a whole life and do all sorts of things before they had children, which now is commonplace. But in the 50s, that was almost unheard of. And anyway,
So the
So my
hippies came in, and what happened?
they had this whole group of young people come in. The guys had hair down to their waist and huge bushy beards, and the girls were wearing tank tops and, torn jeans and everything. And they looked pretty rough because they were just camping out. And they came in, and my dad goes, "Can I help you?" And they said, "Oh man, we're looking for a place where we could pitch some tents and stay. And you have this huge yard, and we just wondered if we could stay here for the night." And to my astonishment, my dad goes, "Oh, that would be fine. That'd be terrific." And he said, "You know what?" He said, "Let me." My dad was a big gardener. He grew huge gardens. And he said, "You know what? I'm going to go through the gardens and pick you fresh tomatoes and cucumbers and give that to you so you can have something to eat tonight and everything." And he sat out there and just visited, and he was regaling them with stories about Native American art and that kind of thing. And he finally got around and he said, "Where are you headed?" And they said, "We're going to this big concert called Woodstock." And they were driving all the way from California to get there. I was too young for that.
Right.
It'll be one of my great regrets.
Well, I imagine your father saw his daughter and his son and those kids, and that's why he felt that way.
Definitely. And both of my parents were very compassionate.
Yeah.
So that the minute they saw something like that, and I also think that their collecting of Native American art, and going out onto the reservations. I've never forgotten going in the early '70s, driving up on the Rosebud Reservation, and I mean, even to this day, it's a level of just abject poverty. It's like a third world nation or worse. And my parents just being horrified that this is what our government, our country, the treatment people had received. And we would go down on the pueblos and everything. And I think it really opened their eyes,
Yeah.
to a world outside of suburbia and the plight of people and everything. And it was a real learning thing. And I was with my parents on those journeys. And I think that had a huge impact on them.
Yeah. And he admired what they did. You have poverty, and he's admiring them not only as humans, but as artists and what they are able to
He
accomplish.
thought they were brilliant artists.
Yeah.
Better.
Yeah. Yeah. So when you graduated from high school, what were you thinking you would do in college?
I was always one of those people who was talented as an artist, Mark.
Hmm.
And I was talented in the sense that I could sit down and render things beautifully. I had great eye-hand coordination. And so I had fallen in love with Andrew Wyeth and George O'Keeffe and Benton. And all through high school, I was emulating. One week I was painting what I thought was like Andrew Wyeth. The next week I was doing a George O'Keeffe. Then I was doing a Benton, crudely. In my mind, they were great. But anyway, I wanted to be an artist. So as an undergraduate, I majored in studio art, painting,
Yeah.
and art history. And then when I graduated as an undergraduate, I took a year off and I took a position in a commercial gallery in Kansas City because I didn't want to just jump. I was uncertain exactly what I wanted to do. And I had decided that I wasn't really interested in teaching, which so many people were always trying to go into, with an MFA degree and that sort of thing. But I went to work for a gallery here in Kansas City, and the gentleman sold only the best Art Nouveau, Art Deco, and arts and crafts,
Hmm.
glass, ceramics, etc. And he was able to do that because his best friend lived in London, worked for Amico Oil, and he could fly all over Europe all the time. And he would go to Paris every weekend and go to the big flea markets and everything. And he had a great eye, and Dean was buying all this material, shipping it back to his friend in Kansas City. So he was buying Gallet and dome glass and, just all sorts of extraordinary things. And this fellow was selling them in his gallery, and he needed somebody to assist him. He was an older gentleman. And so I was in talking to him, and he said, well, have you got a job? I said, no, I really haven't started looking yet. And he said, well, I'd like to hire you, and you could just help me here with the gallery.
Right.
And he said, you've obviously worked for your parents, you've done sales, you've done various things. So he said, I think this might be a good fit. So I actually took my first trip to Europe on a buying trip with him. And we landed in London at Heathrow. Immediately, Dean met us there. We got on a plane and flew to Paris, and got there late at night, went to bed, got up at the crack of dawn the next day, and we just went to flea markets, Mark, and we scrounged and we looked for all sorts of things. And I loved it. It was just like one huge estate sale and everything. But all of a sudden it was time to leave Paris. And I said, we were in a cab going to the airport. And I said, my God, I never even got to see the Eiffel Tower. And one of them said, well, turn around real quick and you can see it out the rear view way. And so I whipped around and I looked, and sure enough, in the background was the Eiffel Tower. And I thought, my God, I've spent my whole trip to Paris going to flea markets. But there again, it was such a fascinating world that most people would never see.
Yeah, I mean,
And
and you're looking for arrowheads, basically.
well, precisely. It was always this, the thrill of the hunt
Yeah.
is so much a part of collecting. And I used to tell people that they would say, well, now of course I look at a lot of online auctions, particularly through the pandemic. And somebody asked me not so long ago, they said, how would you describe your style of looking for things online? And I said, predatory. And they were sort of shocked. And I said, well, I don't know how else to describe it. I said, I am determined to find things, and I can't get out and about right now. So I'm left just hunting through all of these online auctions to satisfy that desire to find something and to continue to collect. But again, like when we were over in Paris, we were at the huge flea market, and we walked into a woman's booth there. She had been a nightclub singer on the big, the ocean liners back in the 40s and 50s, and had sort of been a sensation. She then married some wealthy man who then passed away, and she was, well off. But she had opened this booth in the flea market there, and it was filled with the most extraordinary Art Nouveau furniture and glass. And we walked into her stall, and we saw this very tall African American man. We knew he was from America because he was speaking, very good English and everything. But one of the fellows with me said, God, he said, he must be almost 7 feet tall. And we were chatting, and this fellow walked up to us and he goes, you've got to be from America. And we said, yes, we are. And we introduced ourselves, and he introduced himself, and it was Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. And he was over there buying Art Nouveau furniture for his home in Beverly Hills. You could have knocked me over, Mark. Who would have ever dreamed that this megastar basketball player would be buying these wonderful examples of Art Nouveau furniture?
Yeah, well, he likes art and has good taste.
He does have. I mean, he's a brilliant guy. And but it was, again, it's those kinds of adventures that, I would argue it can only come oftentimes from collecting. A lot of the fun, as you know, is meeting all these other collectors and dealers and all these people, the artists themselves. Everybody has such interesting stories to tell about how they came to this. And I think it's one of the things that drew me eventually to really wanting to work in the museum field. Um, by the time I had finished working for David a year, in the interim, I had applied to Washington University in St. Louis to graduate school. But at that point, I knew I wanted to work in a museum. However, I still went ahead and did a double major of art history and studio art. But I also took a position of working in the University Art Museum. And ironically, like my second day on the job there, I was going through art storage, and Washington University has a major art collection and a major art museum now. But all of a sudden, I found all this Native American art, beadwork and baskets. And I went to the director of the museum and I said, what is this doing here? How did this come here? And he said, no one knows what that stuff is. And I said, you're kidding. And, he was a Yale graduate and everything, PhD. And I said, what do you mean you don't know what it is? And he said, we don't know if it's Native American or African or what it is, Southeast Asian. And I said, I can help you with this. And during the course of my time there, I identified and cataloged all the material that was there. As an aside, it was funny because, this is 1981 through 83. And I found a Ken Price. I don't know if you're familiar with his work. Lived in Taos for many years, had a studio, but is one of the most famous artists in America to have worked in ceramic.
Yes.
And it was from his Cubist period where they're very geometric. And it was him doing a riff on a cup. And he did many of those, and I found that sitting on a table back in art storage. And I got it under the light and I looked in it and I could see these brown stains all in the bottom from something. And I took it to the director and I said, this is a Ken Price cup. And he goes, well, who is that? And I was telling him about it. And he goes, the former director used to drink his coffee out of that every morning. I thought I was going to pass out. I thought, here's a cup that today would be worth in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. And whoever this was is going in there pouring his coffee into it, which only shows, I guess, how things can get lost very quickly, even at a major art museum.
They still do. I have
where
people
they
contacting me periodically, museums, and they have no clue of what they have. It's just shocking sometimes. It's like, yeah, that's a very important piece.
Case in point, I was in Chicago shortly after the millennium, I think it was 2002, and we were waiting for the Art Institute of Chicago to open. I was with a couple of friends, and they, of course, wanted to go get something to eat or something. And I said, oh, there's an antique store across the street. Let's go over there. And they were like, oh, God, no. We don't want to go over there with you. This is a nightmare. But I convinced them. And we went over and we're going through this little antique store, stuff just piled everywhere. And I looked in one of the glass cases and there was a Papago basket sitting there, and it was filled with all this Mexican jewelry. However, in amongst that was a Jesse Monange bracelet.
Wow.
Beautiful and all inlaid and everything. I asked the woman to see it and I pulled it out, and literally it was silver with all the inlay, but it had a section of gold on the interior saying that it was for the millennium, that he had done like a small edition of these. And I said, how did you come by this? And she said, oh, this woman that lived up on Michigan Avenue passed away, and her children were just clearing out the condo and trying to get rid of everything. They lived in New York, and they found a shoebox under her bed, And that was in with just a bunch of costume jewelry. And I said, "What do you want for it?" She said, "Oh, I don't know, $600." And I said, "Well, would you take 500?" And she said, "Absolutely." And my hand was shaking as I wrote out the check for $500. So that's how quickly something fell through the cracks.
Yeah. Yeah, I see it on a regular basis.
I'm sure.
Yeah, people bring in things, and you know,
Well,
as
you must
yeah, as a
have
dealer,
things
sometimes
offered
I
to
can
you.
tell how they walk in with the thing, you know, if they don't even understand. And you know,
Hmm.
I've on more than one occasion said, "Have a seat, you're going to need it," because they don't have a clue, and I'm going to blow their mind, you know,
Yeah,
and they walk in one way holding it, and they walk out another way when they leave cradling it.
absolutely. Yeah, it's their most prized possession.
Often I have had that where they go that they came in saying they really couldn't stand it, and they all of a sudden they love it afterwards. It's amazing
Well,
the
look at how
transformation.
many look how many times we've watched the Antique Roadshow, and you'll see somebody bring something in, a painting or whatever, and the appraiser will say, "Well, now where have you had this painting?" "Oh, it's in the basement. We all hate it.
Yeah,
We can't stand to look at it." And then he'll tell them what it is, and he'll say, "Well, it's probably worth $250,000." And suddenly they'll go, "This is my most favorite thing I own. It's coming up. It's going to hang over the sofa. It's going in the living room." That, or they send it to auction.
yeah. Usually it's the latter,
Usually it's the latter.
and it starts now. The family starts dividing the, you know, the
They've already spent the money by the time they leave the Antique Roadshow.
you know, you see both kinds of families. You see the kind that are generous and loving and empathetic, and they want to share it with their family, and everyone wants it to be equal. And then you see the other ones, it's mine. You didn't want it. It was in my basement. You didn't care. It's all mine. And I see both.
That would be a tough road.
Yeah, I see it a lot actually.
Yeah.
So when you finish, you go to Washington University in St. Louis, and you get your, what do you get there? A
I
master?
got my MFA, my Master of Fine Arts, and I had already applied for and gotten an internship at the Kansas City Museum, which is our history museum. And what they were looking for was somebody to work with their Native American collection. And it was for like a year's internship.
Yeah.
And I knew that they had this extraordinary collection. They have one of the greatest Southern Plains collections of Native American art in the world. And primarily because of one man that was down in Oklahoma and headed a fort down there, actually, and was not the most ethical man by any stretch. Um, but he and his wife had collected lots of, Southern Plains material, and that he eventually in the 1940s gifted to the Kansas City Library, and then that went to the Kansas City Museum. And another person and I worked up in the attic of the museum with this collection, Mark. And I mean, we were literally taking full beaded cradle boards and opening them. They hadn't been opened, they were stuffed with newspapers from like 1905.
Mhm.
But as we would remove these newspapers, we would suddenly find that they had also stuffed them with pairs of moccasins, or they had rolled up cradle liners, hoods that had no kind of structure, and no wooden elements, and they had rolled them up and they used them to stuff the cradle boards. And we were finding, and and there was absolutely no documentation. The only thing the museum had was this like Rolodex that had just these cards, like written in pencil, Indian Shield,
Yeah.
and it would be $1 million Plains Indian Shield, with eagle feathers hanging all over it and everything. And I'll never forget, when I was working there, I was down visiting my parents one weekend, and I was describing this to my dad. I said, we go through, we're doing very elemental conservation, getting rid of any dead insects that are associated with things. We're packing them in, archival tissue, trying to support sections, packing them in acid-free boxes. And he said, well, what do you do with them? And I said, I load them into my car and drive them down to the museum storage in one of the underground caves in Kansas City, downtown. And he said, just you? And I said, yes. And he said, next time you leave the museum, just drive straight home, drive out here. And of course, he was joking. But, things were very different in the museum world at that time. Now you wouldn't think of letting some intern drive with millions of dollars worth of Native American art down to the caves. And I have to admit, one of my most frightening experiences, of course, you're in those caves and the electricity went out. And I was way in the back of this thing. And I thought, it's pitch black, Mark. Your eyes never adjust. There is zero light filtering in. And I thought, I'm going to have to sit down here on the floor and wait for the electric to come back on because otherwise I'm going to have to try and crawl, feeling my way to where the front entrance is. But, it was a real labor of love. We were getting paid, certainly. But, there again, we were able to work with all that material and do basic conservation, get it out of the attic of this huge mansion that forms the Kansas City Museum, which incidentally has been undergoing renovation to the tune of, I think it's $30 million now, and is going to open again this fall. And fortunately, all that Native American material is now stored down at the renovated Union Station, our big train station. Part of that renovation was creating all these state-of-the-art storage facilities. So everything is beautifully stored now, and so it was great fun to play a role in sort of saving all that material, documenting it, so that there were actual records. And from there, I got my first curatorial job, which was at the Panhandle Plains Museum in Canyon, Texas, which you're probably familiar with.
I am, yeah. It's a nice, have a nice collection. I have not been there, but I know Michael
Grauer,
the Dunton expert, was there for years. And I've worked with the museum, but I've never actually, hilariously, even though I grew up only a couple hours from there, I've never been to it.
Well, if you had told me that my first job out of grad school would be down in Canyon, Texas, which coincidentally is where George O'Keeffe taught.
Yeah, that's right.
From like 1914 to 1918. If you can imagine, she was teaching fashion design, amongst other things. But a fellow that I knew that had been a painting conservator at the Nelson Atkins here in Kansas City had taken a position down there. They were building a brand new conservation center that was going to be one of the 9 regional conservation centers in America. And there was a woman there in Amarillo who had inherited $400 million and oil and natural gas. And she had given the museum millions and millions of dollars to build this conservation center, to build a new wing at the museum. That museum is the largest historical museum in the state of Texas. Wow, I mean, it's like 300,000 square feet or something. And they had, I think, 6 or 8 curators. Olive Bugbee had been the curator. Her husband, Harold Bugbee, who was a Western artist back in the 20s and 30s and 40s, he became the curator of art at the Panhandle Plains Museum. When he died, they just made his wife the curator. I was the 3rd curator. I was the only professionally trained curator, the first one. And they had this wonderful collection of Taos and New Mexico artists, as well as crazy things. They had a huge Henri Daumier painting that had come from somebody. And ironically, most of the painting collection had come from a woman whose last name was Griffin. And they were like around Wichita Falls and into Kansas, and they were ranchers and oil people. And she had amassed this big collection and gave it to the Panhandle Plains Museum. They got the Frank Ray estate, who was a major Texas artist. And I was there for 2 years. I had a blast. I made sure that I did a lot of shows borrowing from Santa Fe,
Yeah, I bet.
and our budget was tiny. So I would always volunteer to drive over and pick things up so that I could be in Santa Fe once a month. It was glorious. And, just had a great time. It was one of those experiences, Mark, that colleagues of mine, when they learned where I was going, they said, "Well, my God, that's the end of your career." I mean, who would take a job like that out in the panhandle of Texas? You've lost your mind. They were just horrified at the thought of moving to a small town and everything. And I will never forget, I hadn't been there a week, and a couple invited me over to their home. And, they had a very nice home there, brick, but I walked in the front door, and over their fireplace was one of the greatest Charles Birchfield paintings
Wow.
I'd ever seen. And then I looked over, and here was another huge Charles Birchfield. And then I looked over, and here was a Demuth and an Edward Hopper and a Mary Cassatt, and John Marin's. It was unbelievable. And they had made all this money in oil and natural gas. And I asked them how they started collecting. And they said, years ago when we were just starting out, we all bought the young couples, we bought these homes in this new housing division. And we were young, everybody had young children. There wasn't a whole lot to do out here in Amarillo. They were up in Amarillo. And she said, we decided that we would start, playing card games and everything. And so we would invite couples, and we would rotate every week. We go to his home. And she said, we went in, and there were all these weird paintings everywhere, dozens and dozens of them. And she said, my husband and I asked, we said, did your children do these? And she said, no. She said, my father was a very famous artist. His name was Charles Birchfield. And Birchfield had a number of children. This one daughter had married a marketing guy who got a job in Amarillo. They moved there and took all these Birchfield paintings with them. And this woman said, at first we thought these were the most grotesque paintings we'd ever seen. But she said, after going to their house and they were explaining them and we started reading, and we ended up going to New York and going to Kennedy Galleries and talking to Larry Flashman, who was a very famous American art dealer. She said we fell in love with them. And so we bought several. And then we bought the Edward Hopper watercolor, and we bought the Demuth, and that was their collecting journey, which all started from playing canasta, and going over to a couple's home and seeing all these paintings. So from Texas, I became curator at Cranbrook Academy of Art Museum up in the Detroit area. And of course, that's a very famous museum and a famous masters only program at the Academy of Art. And interestingly enough, Cranbrook's, are you familiar with it, Mark?
I've heard of it.
It's where Charles and Ray Eames went to school, and Harry Bertoia,
Yeah.
Florence Knoll,
Yeah.
Eero Saarinen was raised there. Elio Saarinen, his father, designed the whole thing.
I love Knowles and Bertoia, so that would explain why I would know it.
Well, and it sits on 300 acres in the middle of Bloomfield Hills, Michigan, which is one of the most exclusive suburbs communities in the world. And I used to see Lee Iacocca getting his newspaper in his bathrobe every morning. He'd be out in the front yard picking up the newspaper, and Aretha Franklin lived nearby, and all these celebrities and everything. But I was there then for almost 4 years, and then the position came up down here at the college to open a new gallery of art on campus in what at that time was called the Cultural Education Center, and that made my journey back to Kansas City. And 30 years later, I'm now retired and off on new adventures.
Yeah, what are those new adventures now that you've done 30 years in one institution, you love art, you've grown up with art, you've curated shows from contemporary to now working with the museum Crystal Bridges, helping them.
Mm-hmm.
So what do you do now? What's your second act or third or whatever you want to say?
I'm continuing to refine my own personal collection. I've really kind of narrowed it down to where my personal collection, now this isn't to say I won't buy something terrific outside of these genres, but really focusing on Native American painting, all the way from the historic period up to contemporary. Jewelry, particularly Zuni jewelry of the 40s and 50s. I fell in love with, we attended the C.G. Wallace auction, and I fell in love with all of that. And so I've amassed a collection of great Zuni inlay, as well as other pieces. And then also fetishes, stone fetishes, but really pre-1950. I ended at essentially Leakia and Teddy Wiaki and Poblano, but going back before the turn of the century also. And so I continue to search for things, but I'm also working with the Nelson Atkins Museum here in Kansas City because they approached me, the director there, and asked me about doing a major exhibition at the Nelson in probably 2024, 2025 of my Native American painting collection. And so I'm very particular about how the paintings are framed. As you well know, most of these things I'm sure come into your gallery. You have no idea what kind of condition they're going to be in. They're almost always in the cheapest frames imaginable. And so, it's taking those, getting them conserved if they need it. And then I work with a framer in Santa Fe who has been custom making frames for several decades for me for these paintings. And anyway, working towards doing that exhibition. I'm also looking at building a new house, and then if we should ever get out from under the shadow of COVID, I would love to travel again and get out and about. I am so eager to go to New York City. Only this time I'd like to go and stay for a couple of months. On my museum trips, even though we would sometimes take trips that were 2 or 3 weeks in New York, I was with collectors, with patrons. I was working and doing the art fairs and galleries and et cetera. Right. And I've always yearned to be able to go to New York and if you're there for 3 or 4 or 5 weeks or more, go to the museums and you know what? Actually have time to read the labels. Yeah. And look at things that I wouldn't have looked at before. Go into galleries that I never explored and met, and just enjoy that. I've always wanted to see the unicorn tapestries that are up north. I don't know if you're familiar with those, but that's up at the north end of the island. And when I was traveling for contemporary art, no one had any interest in doing that. So I'm really looking forward to hopefully getting to do some of that and do podcasts with Mark Sublette, I guess.
There you go.
when the opportunity arises.
Well, have you written any books at all? Because you have this vast knowledge in many fields, and it seems, of course, fetishes would be a one that's obvious, but I mean, I can see many different books. Maybe that's
Well,
something you might want to consider.
jokingly, I threaten to write my memoirs, which scares people, um, because I've traveled with so many wealthy collectors for years. So I get great fun out of threatening to do that and tell all the secrets. But we're currently working on a major book. It was in production when COVID hit. And it is a major monograph on the museum and the campus. And it chronicles the 30 years I was here, and from the opening of the old gallery of art to the opening and beyond of the museum. And it's at about 550 pages right now, and it will be a major coffee table book. And we only have one thing left, and that is for me to finish my introduction, Mark. And the designer has everything. It's almost completely designed, and we're hoping to go to press with that maybe in November, December, and so bring that to fruition. So I've been involved in a range of books, but not on Native American art per se. Although certainly the museum monograph will mix contemporary Native American art. You'll see, a great Native American piece, and on the opposite page will be an extraordinary, a Kerry James Marshall painting. So we're continuing that, what we do in the museum, we're continuing that right into the book. Um, so until I get all these things completed, then I might think about something else. I know the Nelson would like to do a major book on the Native American painting collection and potentially travel the show.
Yeah.
And so that will become another project.
I see that as becoming,
There's no shortage of.
yeah, I was going to say, I
There's
see
no
that as
shortage of
becoming
things to
a
do.
Native American painters, specifically from, the 1920s through contemporary. I can see that becoming much more involved, more collectors, and a very important place for new collectors. I know people like Tony Abeda, who we talked about a little bit. I mean, he's a big supporter of that in his own collecting habits, and he's got a great eye and a great collection. And I feel it's kind of flipped. It's finally, I feel there is a group of people who really are now starting to get it when it comes to Native American art, fine art, and like Shanto Begay and his big show,
Absolutely.
those kind of things. I would love to see something like a Shanto Begay be at the Whitney.
Yes. Yes.
Change a lot of things.
I'd love to see this show that the Nelsons organizing go to the Whitney.
Yeah, exactly.
And have them, and actually have them show Awat Sierras and Tonita Peñas and things that they actually showed back in the 1940s because of John Sloan and other artists that were working, in New Mexico. We're then taking some of those artists back to New York and getting them shown in the major museums.
Willard Stone.
Really,
are you familiar with Willard Stone? You probably are.
yes. Yes.
I mean, he was one of those that was showing in New York. I actually collect Willard's work. So he's one of those ones I think is just an unsung hero, amazing carver. And
I just looked at a whole group of them at Pearson Street Gallery there in Tulsa. We'll talk. She had some great ones.
Yeah, she's gotten them in the past. Yeah, and I've gotten some things actually from her.
Good.
I've got the Cherokee warrior that with the arms up like that from like 1943, and a snake with two heads, the one that was his commentary on Vietnam War with the Roadrunner and the snake, one underneath the foot and one over. So I've got some of his most important pieces that the Gilcrease doesn't have. The Gilcrease has, of course, has so much amazing Willard Stone. He was really, and I encourage people who don't know about this artist to go to the Gilcrease and see their collection. And there's a beautiful book that they did on the collection as well.
And they're closed currently because they are tearing down the original museum even as we speak. And they got a bond issue passed, for hundreds of millions, and they're building a brand new Gilcrease Museum from the ground up.
Wow, that's fantastic.
And it is fantastic. And of course, that collection, as you well know, is staggering.
It is.
It's one of my favorite museums to go to. And it's kind of a secret. So many people are unaware of it.
Yeah, they have so many
And
Thomas Morans. I mean, it's unbelievable.
oh, incredible, incredible. Big Winslow Homers.
Yeah.
It runs the gamut. Have you been to Woolaroc
Oh, yeah.
up
Yep.
in
Oh,
Bartlesville?
yeah. Yeah, no, they
Okay.
have the last time I was there, I remember making a comment, you might want to take that first phase Chiefs blanket and not put some tacks in it and maybe put it a little differently.
Or make sure there's mothballs in the cases, etc. That is a museum frozen in time.
Yes, it is.
I have to admit that I just was through it again a couple of years ago, and I was kind of thrilled that nothing had changed. It was just like right out of the 1940s or 50s.
I remember they had an
But they
Alfred
had some,
Jacob Miller painting, a little small one that was maybe 5 by 8, right next to an exit hanging on a hook. And I thought,
ah,
oh God, anyone could grab that and take it. That's insane.
don't
But
do it, Mark. Don't do
no,
it.
I didn't do it then. I won't do it now. But it is an amazing museum. Even though we may be making a little bit of fun of how things are hung, and I don't know if that's the case now, but it is an amazing collection and well worth the
It is.
effort to go see it.
Uh, and just going for people who are unfamiliar, it was of course the
Phillips.
ranch that Phillips Petroleum had up outside of Bartlesville, and of course the Philbrook Museum in Tulsa was their city home, which is that big Italianate mansion
Right.
with many additions, but which also has an extraordinary Native American
They
collection.
do an amazing one,
Um,
including pottery.
but I'll never forget going to Woolaroc, which stands for wood, lakes, and rocks. And we drove across that cattle guard going in there, and all of a sudden here were water buffaloes and zebras and
Right.
all sorts of animals just roaming around.
Yep.
Right outside, it was like going to a safari land or something. But going in that building, they have those enormous William R. Lee paintings,
Yes.
the most dramatic and biggest ones I've ever seen. They're mural size.
Yeah.
And so it's filled with treasures for people that are interested in looking. I was talking to Josh Bear recently, and he's working on this book on first phase blankets, and I had to say, you've got to go to Woolaroc and check out what they have tacked up on the walls up high. Unreal.
So let me ask you as we close this out, you've done a life of art, really, not only as a collector, but as a curator, as a student of both Native American, historic and contemporary art. What is your suggestion to maybe young people who are thinking about going into this field? Should they? I mean, I guess that's as good I mean, I would think you would say yes, but it's a very competitive, very difficult road to heal. And it's not one that's really well paid, I don't think, for the most part.
Museums have improved a lot on that in recent years. You do now see museums employees forming unions. I think the Whitney may have just been unionized. But certainly at the curatorial level and above, while some of the jobs may not be high paying until you get to the director level, it depends on the institution. But I've always felt enormously lucky because I always think of that Thoreau saying about what is it, 90% of men lead lives of quiet desperation. And so many people are spending their lives doing things that they're not passionate about, that they are not engaged in, that they don't feel like they're contributing. Um, and I feel so fortunate that my parents set me on a path that became a lifelong passion and really the great love of my life. And I can't encourage younger people enough to go into it as a field. You and I have been kidding around a lot and talking about, hunting things and finding things. But it's thrilling and you can make a real contribution. And there are still fields that are relatively unexplored, like Native American art. There's so much yet to be done in terms of contextualizing Native American art with the whole story of American art in museums, and that's true of many other fields of art as well. Um, but it's been enormously rewarding, um, to work because I went into contemporary art, Mark. Um, I got to work with living artists. A lot of times you go into fields like American art or Impressionism or other fields, medieval, Renaissance, classical antiquities. All the artists are dead. But I loved going into contemporary because I got to meet the artists. I got to go to their studios, interface with them, help them realize commissions or exhibitions. And that's been hugely rewarding and forming long friendships with people and, traveling all over the world. It's been really exciting. It's been never a dull moment, and there aren't a lot of jobs you can say that about. But I have to say that the museum field, that collecting, that the art world is truly exciting, and I can't imagine having done anything else.
Well, congratulations to you. You've lived a good
Thank you.
life. You've done a lot of things for Native American art, as well as contemporary art, clearly, but you continue to be a leader in our field. And just because you're retired, I expect you to continue to work hard and continue to follow your heart and your passion. I look forward to seeing your collection at the Nelson Atkins, and hopefully they will get that to travel and hopefully to the Whitney. It would be a wonderful thing.
Well, it would be wonderful. I'll quote a friend of mine who retired at the age of 58, the gentleman that was living in London. And after he retired, about 6 months later, I was with him and someone said, "Well, what do you do all day? How do you fill your time?" And he said, "Oh my God." He said, "I have so much to do that I realize how inconvenient working was." He said, "I've got more to do now than I did when I was working. I can't imagine how I got all my personal stuff done." and, I think that, again, with the art world, there's so many avenues, you can go into working with not for profits and serving, on boards and various things, and just being out there in the art world, going to the openings and meeting people and everything. And I look at you, and how long have you been in the gallery business?
Almost 30 years now with a gallery, actually
And
longer than that if you count. I was doing it before I ever had a gallery. So
and you don't seem to be slowing down.
no, not yet.
Not yet,
Not yet.
because you love it.
Yeah, no, I do. I do like what I do a great deal. I don't get bored. I still find art to be compelling, and I'm just artists. I love working with artists, living artists. I think that's a real gift to be able to work with living artists, not just the old stuff, but people that have real families and history, and to me, and to watch them grow and to succeed. That's a great part of it.
and that are creating right now. And look, Mark, at what you've done in terms of Maynard Dixon. And I always think of you as kind of really contributing enormously to research on him and gaining greater recognition.
Yeah, I think it's part of our job and part of our duty as a dealer. If you spend, like I have 30 years in this field, that you better give back. You better add to the, the history of and the database. I think it's very important. I mean, because if you live this entire life and you have all this knowledge and you gain it, but then you don't share it, did you ever have it?
Well, and if you love the art and the artist, you want to.
Yeah.
It's a labor of love
Yeah.
because you want to make sure that Maynard Dixon gets the recognition he so much deserves, and get the work out before the public and everything. And you've been in that field long enough to be able to do that, and to discover, so to speak, artists like that maybe have not gotten the recognition they deserve.
Yeah, it is wonderful.
Now you can't imagine it. You can't imagine that he wouldn't have all the attention imaginable. But I'm sure when you first started, um, people were wondering what in the world you were doing.
Yeah, they did. Especially some of the dealers were like, why would you just focus on this one person's artwork so much? It's like, well, why would you marry somebody and stay with them for 40 years? You love them. You find something you really care about,
And
spend the time.
you find a terrific artist, and you realize, my God, this is going to be part of my life's work.
Yeah. Yeah, you get to a point where you actually start thinking about that artist and how they would think on certain things in your own life. Like, how would Maynard handle this situation? What would it have done to him? Especially with the pandemic, has been very interesting because he was so, during that time frame for him, which was 1918, to 20, really. He almost gave up on art in 1918. And I think a lot of it had to do not only with his divorce from his first wife, but also the pandemic was stifling for him. He's stuck in his studio for like 3 months, couldn't go out, had, bad lungs. And, it was like, this is, horrific. And people are not, it's also World War I, the ending of World War I. So you had all these things that came down, that we think we have it tough, and we do at times, but still imagine, 700,000 Americans dying in 1918 through 20, and you also have World War I going on. My God, it's just mind-boggling.
Unfortunately, I think we're going to exceed that number in this go around.
Oh yeah, we are. They have already said we'll exceed the actual number, though it won't be near the number per populace as it was then. So you're talking 3 to 5% of the world's population died because of the influenza. Yeah. So
unreal.
Well, on that happy note.
Exactly. Well, this has been great fun. Thank you for urging me to do this.
Yes, no, I really appreciate getting to spend a little time with you. We've had conversations for decades, and now it's nice to actually have a little bit more of the background, and everyone will as well. And again, we look forward to seeing the Nelson Atkins show comes out, and going to Crystal Bridges, which again, we both think is a magnificent museum, and seeing the collection that they bought from you. That's fantastic.
Absolutely. And watching them add to their Native American collection.
Yeah, good for her. Good for
absolutely.
Everybody. That's in Bentonville, Arkansas, by the way, if you don't know. Bentonville.
Good for all of us. Good for all of us, Mark.
It is, actually. It is. All right. Well, thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate it. And I'll let you know when this goes out. I'm going to give you a call sometime in the future here too, to discuss a few other things. So
I'll look forward to it. Take care.
All right. Thanks.